as the fresh reference blood sample from Mr. O.J. Simpson. And there has been testimony in this case that the reference samples both from Mr. Goldman and from Nicole Brown Simpson were not processed in that room on that day. Now, assuming that while that situation existed, that Mr. Simpson's sample was in the evidence processing unit at the same time that the Bundy swatches were processed, and there was contact between the fresh blood of Mr. Simpson and the Bundy swatches, could that also produce the results that you achieved in your DNA typing?
Objection. Improper hypothetical misstates the evidence and assumes facts, not an evidence. Right. Overruled.
Yes.
So this is cross-contamination. I'm going to, just so I can distinguish these two, I'm going to call the first type of cross-contamination with the Rockingham swatches.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Is this going to be an exhibit marked or?
Yes.
All right.
And
Then I
We got a problem with this one.
that was going to be my objection.
All right. It's becoming argumentative, counsel, not demonstrative.
Well, one moment.
Well, Your Honor, counsel's already writing on it again. I think the court.
I'm just
is
writing
stop.
on.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, would you step back in the jury room, please? Jury has withdrawn from the courtroom. Mr. Neufeld, the problem we have is the same problem that caused your objection to the prosecution's boards. Now this contains argument. It's not a demonstration of the evidence. It's not an exposition of the evidence. It's argument.
No, I'm sorry. If I said I was going to have it marked, I meant marked for identification solely for demonstrative purposes. I'm not going to introduce it into evidence. And I apologize for if I...
No, that's not the way we do it. If it is an exhibit, something displayed to the jury, it cannot contain argument.
Then
All
I
you
will
can
only...
do, the only thing you can do, I understand exactly what it is you're doing here. What you can do is list the possibilities. You can list the locations. Bundy, Rockingham, ECU, or ECR. You can list those things, but to then argue contamination, to put in things that aren't necessarily in evidence, that's argument. We don't know that there's contamination. Do you understand my point?
Yeah, but, Your Honor, the initial questions that I asked the witness were permissible and admissible questions, and her answers saying that another explanation would be old blood drops is also admissible. If I simply limit myself on this diagram to writing...
The only thing you can do is put, for example, Bundy, old blood drops, period, without argument.
Fine.
All right?
And then on the second one, what I would put is Rockingham swatches EPU, and nothing more. And the third one I would do...
Is it essence processing, or I thought it was evidence processing room.
I'm sorry. I'll put evidence processing room, okay? And the third one would be...
Is there a possibility we could prepare these before we do this too?
Yes. If I can have 2 minutes, I'll prepare it, and then we can be heard, and I'll save time.
Do it.
Your Honor, in addition to that, I think once the court sustained its objection and Mr. Neufeld kept writing, it was extremely improper.
We'll get to that.
There's another issue that you said we can take during the break.
Let's spend the 2 minutes to finish with this thought.
All right, we're going to have to take a break.
Not till 3:30. Actually, 3:15.
All right.
But the court reporter is sitting here working, so. John, stretch your legs a moment. You're my guest. Don't go away, though. .315 and come back to 4:30. No, don't lure me into that again. Don't you think tampering is a argument rather than
All I'm asking you,
rather than the word contamination?
Your Honor, all I'm trying to elicit from this witness is that she cannot give a probability. I'm not even saying it was tampering. I'm simply saying that you permitted the question before that this is not a probability concerning whether or not there was tampering. I just want to put on this chart the same statement that she basically already said verbally. That's all it is.
May I see the chart at some point?
Oh, you can take a look at it right now.
I would certainly concur with the court. The word tampering is extraordinarily argumentative. And the problem with this whole chart is the fact that there's been no evidence of the type of contamination or contact that the
Well, counsel, you know that I have to allow hypothetical questions if there is a possibility that those facts could be established.
Your Honor.
But I agree, tampering is not an appropriate word for this type of exhibit. You can put in contamination, because contamination can be either benign or malevolent.
Fine, what I'd like to do then, I will change the word tampering to simply deliberate contamination. Which, no, the reason, Your Honor, is I believe that we have...
I admire your chutzpah. Contamination, counsel. It can be benign, it can be malevolent. We don't know. It could be non-existent.
Can I put down malevolent contamination? Use your words. No, no, I mean, quite seriously, Your Honor, and I
And
think that...
I'm equally serious. You can have contamination. That's what you get, right?
Then what I'll do is I will change tampering to other forms of contamination.
Contamination.
Okay.
That
Well,
pretty much
since I
covers it.
described two types already, I would just like to be able to say as other contamination.
Mr. Neufeld, for the 5th time, contamination. I'll give you some scotch tape and a scissor.
Can we do this again in 1 minute? What I was going to do, I can do it now, is as I did in the first one, there was a question mark. I was going to put in question marks until I got to the coincidental match, at which point I was going to insert the frequency estimate given by the witness. I can do it in front of the jury, or I can do it now and just have her...
So if all you're going to do is repeat what's there, that's fine. Question marks are fine.
recite.
The question marks are fine.
Okay.
Let's proceed.
Not my forte, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
It counts, Mr. Neufeld.
Let's put it in.
go.
Could I see your own?
Sure.
Yeah, let me put it up.
Madam Reporter, do you want to take a break? You ready to go through to 4:30?
I'm gonna need a break. Not till 4:30, that's all.
Well, we might as well take our break now. All right, let's take 10. Please be seated. Let the record reflect we've now been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed any further, if you recollect at the beginning of the trial, I instructed you that you were to ignore anything that I'm doing up here, any of my expressions. For example, if I suddenly start to write down something, that doesn't mean that what the witness just said was important. I mean, for all you know, I'm just writing a note to myself to stop at the market and get dog food on the way home. So don't pay any attention to what I'm doing up here. And if I appeared to be annoyed at any time to a question or to an attorney or about that, disregard that, because my opinions, expressions, reactions to things are not evidence, not relevant to your determination in this case. All right, Dr. Cotton, would you resume the witness stand, please? Good afternoon again, Doctor. And Mr. Neufeld, you may continue.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Cotton, please excuse my handwriting, printing. First of all, Your Honor, if I may, I just want an acknowledgement from the jury that they can at least see it from where they are.
1492.
I can see most of it, except contamination.
You got it, sir. Okay.
All right,
All right.
proceed.
Now, Dr. Cotton, when we left off, you said that, for instance, if the stains at Bundy came from older blood drops, that would still be consistent with the results that you got and the numbers that you generated, correct?
That's right.
And you also said, I believe, that if in fact, while the Bundy swatches were in the evidence processing room and they were cross-contaminated, they were degraded and cross-contaminated with the Rockingham swatches, that also would give you the same result that you have, correct?
If you had enough contamination, yes.
Even if the Bundy drops initially came from someone other than Mrs. Simpson.
Yes.
And also you, well, we didn't get to this before, but we've now done this during the break. If, in fact, on the morning, during the day of the 14th, when the Bundy swatches were in the same evidence processing room with Mr. Simpson's reference sample, fresh reference sample, at a time when the reference samples of Mr. Goldman and Ms. Nicole Brown Simpson were not there, and they came in contact with one another, that too could produce the same results that you have on through DNA typing at Cellmark, correct?
Yes.
An objection assumes facts, not an evidence.
Noted. Overruled.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer.
With The same caveat, assuming there's enough contamination, the answer is yes.
Right. And again, you also said that, obviously, if there's a coincidental match, in other words, if somebody else has the same profile as Mr. Simpson, that too would be able to generate the results that you got in the laboratory, correct?
Of course.
And finally, if there was some other type of contamination at another time, another place, either unintentional or deliberate, that too could produce the same results that you have on your DNA testing, correct?
Depending on what the contamination was from, it may or may not.
Okay, well, assuming that the type of contamination was the same type as described in item 2 here and item 3, but it occurred at a different time, in a different place, and perhaps not so benign, somewhat malevolent, excuse me, nonetheless, would it too generate the same result that you got in the DNA profiling in this case?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you said that you don't know the probability of it being old drops, correct?
Well, objection. Assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Right. Assuming that they were old drops, you have no idea what the probability of that occurring is, do you?
Same objection.
He's already been asked and answered that question.
Would it be fair to say that for all of these explanations, the only one that you can give a frequency estimate on is that of a coincidental match?
Of course.
Okay. Now, return. And I believe next in order would be 1144. Is that correct?
11:44.
Okay. Oops. Thank you. Now, Dr. Codden, as an expert, you are often called upon to interpret data. Is that right?
Yes?
And
Sorry to interrupt. Are we finished with the exhibit?
no, I'm going to come right back to the exhibit, with these next questions. And sometimes there may be more than one explanation for a certain piece of data. Isn't that right?
You mean in terms of the data that we're looking at for any specific sample set?
Well, no. Just in terms of data as a side. Let me give you an example, a specific example. I believe you said on direct examination, let me put this up first. I'm now putting up on the Elmo People's Exhibit 257D. I believe you said on direct examination that there may be more than one explanation, for instance, why some bands are faint and others are darker.
Yes.
However, you said the most common explanation is that it's because there is less DNA in that lane. Is that correct?
That's right.
And then I think you said also that there are other secondary explanations, but they are not as common. Is that correct?
There are other secondary explanations that could contribute to a band either being darker or lighter than some other band.
But the most common explanation is because there's less DNA in the lane?
Yes.
Now, likewise, Dr. Cotton, in the various explanations that appear on defendant's exhibit, which is right next to you at this point, 1144, if any of those explanations occur with greater frequency than the 1 in 180 million, would those other explanations deserve greater attention by you?
Objection argumentative.
Sustain.
All right, we can remove the exhibit. Since there'll be more drawing, I'm just going to turn the page. believe you said on direct examination that if you were to open up a cell, human cell that contained chromosomes, and you took out all the DNA out of that single cell, there would be approximately 3 billion base pairs. Is that correct?
No, I said 6.
Is that 6 billion base pairs or 6 billion bases?
6 billion base pairs.
Okay. And I believe you also said that approximately 99% of all of our DNA is identical. Is that correct?
That's a rough estimation. In fact, it's probably somewhat greater than 99%.
And when you say that, let's say for argument's sake, 99% is the same in all of us, you mean that the DNA that defines us as a species, as human beings, as opposed to a lobster, for instance, is all the same.
Yes.
And so the DNA that decides that we have hands and not claws is going to be the same in all of us who are sitting in this room.
We hope so.
Some lobsters don't have claws.
It's an Eastern thing, Your Honor. Now you have Maine.
No, I just said some lobsters.
All right. But it's that remaining 1%, more or less, where there is some variation within the human population, right?
Yes.
And that 1%, according to your estimate, would be approximately 60 million base pairs. Is that right?
I think that's right, yes.
And your tests that you do at Cellmark don't compare the 60 million base pairs showing variation within the human population, do they?
Of course not.
When Cellmark does a forensic test, it examines how many different markers within the chromosomes?
Oh,
When it does an RFLP test.
We have at our lab the capability of looking at 5. Some labs have the capability of looking at more, but that's what we're currently doing.
And for your PCR markers, you look at how many?
6. Well, we now have the capability of looking at 9, but for this case, we looked at 6, and so 6 would be the relevant answer.
And so would it be fair to say that there are millions and millions of base pairs showing variation that your tests don't examine?
Of course.
Now, when you say that a particular marker of DNA, that everyone is different for some of these markers, don't you mean that if for a particular genetic marker there is some degree of variation within the population?
Well, I didn't say that for any marker, everyone is different. But, and so your second statement is the accurate statement.
Okay. And would you also agree, I think you said it on direct, that for some of these markers there's very little variation, in fact, within the population, whereas for some of the RFLP markers there is considerably more?
That's right.
For instance, for some of the individual markers that make up your polymarker test, one of them is called LDLR, is that right?
Yes.
And how many different versions are there of the LDLR marker?
In that as that test is able to detect it too.
Right. So would you agree that, for instance, there's more diversity in eye color within the population than there is for the LDLR marker that you use for forensic testing?
Well, it's probably not a great comparison, but the point is correct.
Well, would you agree also that that there's not a single RFLP that you actually utilize that would be unique to any one person? I guess that's redundant. Would be that one person would have and no one else would have. Is that a fair statement? At a single RFLP?
I don't think that I don't think we actually know the answer to that question.
Well, for any of the RFLPs that you utilized in this case, for which you profiled Mr. Simpson, is there any particular band that you have found that is totally unique in the human population?
As the bands are measured in this test, there are probably not ones that are unique in the population.
Okay. And I believe you also said that the first thing you do when conducting a DNA test and looking at the autorad is you make a visual comparison. Is that right?
It's not the first thing we do when we're conducting a test,
No,
but
after you
the
have
first
the
thing we
autorad.
do when you have the film off is to make a visual assessment of what's on that film.
And correct me if I'm mistaken, Dr. Cotton, because I want to get this right, but if they are visually indistinguishable, do you then declare them to be a match?
No.
Do you declare them to appear to be consistent with one another?
Well, at that point, we're not declaring them to be anything, because at that point, then you're going to go ahead and do the computer imaging system assessment of band size, and then you would make an assessment as whether you had a match or not. So,
And so I'm sorry, I don't mean to
so
interrupt.
you're not writing anything down. You're not saying, I have this opinion. You're just going forward.
All right. So, and you go forward to the computer because, would you agree that it's necessary to have some objective and quantitative procedure for measuring the size of these bands?
The computer gives you a quantitative procedure, and it assists you in having an objective procedure, but it doesn't completely provide an objective procedure because the machine isn't smart enough to make the judgments that the human eye can make.
So it's the combination then of the person with the computer that gives you an objective and quantitative procedure for measuring the size of bands.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned that given the limitations of the system, the imprecision of the system, you said that no band would be unique in your system. Is that correct?
For a single genetic location. I mean, we don't really know. I'm just saying, based on what we do know and our experience, I wouldn't want to say that there was one that was unique. So.
Well, you mentioned when you're talking about imprecision that if bands don't necessarily line up exactly, in other words, one band could have more base pairs than another band, under your system and given its imprecision, you would still declare a match. Is that correct?
If they're close enough in their measured number of base pairs, yes.
All right. Let me ask you, just to illustrate this point, assume this is the autorad, and you have a band in lane 1. All right? And that band is, let's call it 10,000 base pairs. Okay, in other words, your computer has looked at that band and measured it and determined that it is a 10,000 base pair band.
Fine.
All right? Okay. Now, given your system's imprecision, how much bigger could a band be or smaller could a band be than 10,000 base pairs, and you still declare it a match under your procedure?
If you want the precise answer to that question, I need to look in our standard operating procedure, but if you'll accept something that's reasonably close,
I will.
the figure would be about 4%. There's this whole set of figures, so I'm trying to remember what the figure is in that size range, but 4% is going to be close to whatever the actual figure is.
Okay, now 4% of 10,000 is approximately what, 400?
Yes.
So if a band in lane 2 was, let's say, a little bit larger, 10,000 400 base pairs, under your system's imprecision, you would still declare a match between these two bands, even though one has 400 more base pairs to it than the other. Is that correct?
Yes, given my example of 4%, yes.
Okay. Well, is that a correct approximation? If it's not, please give me another one.
I'm just telling you it's close.
Okay.
I just don't remember the exact set of figures.
And likewise, if the band was smaller than 10,000 and was only, let's say, 9,000 600 base pairs, under your system's imprecision, you would still declare a match between the 9,600 base pair band and the 10,000 base pair band. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. One moment. Now, would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that within that range that I gave you there, 9,600 to 10,400 base pairs, there could be, in fact, in reality, that is, different and distinct alleles?
Of course.
Given the imprecision of your system, Dr. Cotton, that you've just described, if an item of evidence and a suspect have a band, for a particular band, which in fact differ by, in our example here, let's say 400 base pairs, then you would declare the suspect and the item to be a match. Is that right? Just for that band.
Yes.
And even if, in fact, the suspect's band represented a different allele than the evidentiary allele, you would still make that declaration of a match given your system's imprecision for that single band. Is that correct?
Well, let me be clear here. In our laboratory, we don't ever report a match based on a single band.
Right.
But if you're asking me, do you have this size band and this size band and they're within the correct range, are they going to be called a match? The answer is yes.
Well, just so I can understand the system, and in fact, in this particular case, when you actually did computer sizings, you did computer sizings of the bands in this case, didn't you?
Oh, yes.
And when you compared, for instance, a band in lane 52, and then you sized a band in Mr. Simpson's reference lane, the number of base pairs that your computer came up with was not the same number for both those lanes. Isn't that correct?
They're not identical. That's correct.
Okay. Now, one moment, Your Honor. Now, I take it, Dr. Cotton, that to arrive at a frequency of 1 in 170 million people, you did not test the blood of 170 million people.
That's obviously correct.
In fact, you didn't test the blood of even 1 million people. Is that right?
Not in my lifetime.
Or even 100,000 people?
We tested, as I said before, for the database, the size ranges from about 150 to about 325. If you add all the people in the database up, all three racial groups, it comes to around 500 to 600.
And it's taking a number, well, let me ask you, you gave a number, though. For instance, for for the profile, Mr. Simpson's profile, you said you'd expect to see it in 1 out of 170 million people in the African American population. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And how large is your African American database from which you generated that number?
If you'll hang on just a minute,
Certainly.
I'll tell you. I'm ready.
Okay.
What I'll do is read you the sizes for the number of people that are in each probe one by one because they're not all the same.
Well, let me ask you this then. You mean is there a single group of people who your laboratory has identified as African Americans on whom you ran all 5 of the probes that were utilized in this case?
No, there's a lot of overlap between who's, for example, been tested with MS1 and MS31 and so on, but the samples do not have, most of the samples do not have all 5 probes across each sample.
All right. Can you tell us how many of the samples you did run all 5 probes on in the African American population?
Not without going back and doing a lot of figuring from the database. I don't know that off the top of my head.
What I would simply ask is that between tonight, perhaps when we break, and tomorrow, maybe you can make some phone calls, and there's someone back at Cellmark who could help you learn that, so I could ask you tomorrow.
I'll try to get that information. I don't know, I haven't been at Cellmark for a while. I don't know which of my lab staff are available to help me find things in the lab.
Thank you very much.
Take into account the time difference, too.
Certainly. Well, putting that aside, and starting out with your premise that you can't really say how many people were subjected to all 5 probes, why don't you give me the range then for within your African American database?
There are 240 people for MS1, 238 for MS31, 223 for MS43, 200 for G3, and 146 for YNH24.
So would you agree that at a maximum, the greatest number of African Americans in your African American database who have been subjected to all 5 probes would be that 140-something number you gave for YNH24?
146.
146 people.
Yes.
Okay. And so, based on your analysis of 146 people of African American ancestry, you arrived at a combined frequency in this case of 1 in 170 million people. Is that correct?
No, it's not, because some of the probes had quite a large number, more than 146, and since you're looking at the frequency of bands for each individual probe, the frequencies are not, the fact that you don't have each person across all 5 probes doesn't affect your ability to look at a frequency for a specific probe.
Fine, Dr. Codden. So it's 200. What's the largest number? What's the largest number in the database for any of those 5 probes?
240.
So what you did was you looked at the DNA profiles of 240 people, and from that you extrapolated a number for the frequency of Mr. Simpson's DNA profile of 1 in 170 million people. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And would you agree that there has been some controversy about the appropriateness of using databases that size for extrapolating these kinds of large numbers?
Objection, hearsay. Also irrelevant.
Overruled.
I don't think that the controversy has arisen around the size of the database, and there is literature to support databases of this size for this purpose.
Well, let me go back. One moment, Your Honor. Back to you. I just need to get the diagrams that Dr. Cotton made yesterday.
Which diagrams? The hand-drawn diagrams?
The hand-drawn diagrams. Now, to compile this African American database, did you seek subjects from different countries in Africa?
No,
Did you seek subjects from different African American communities scattered across the United States?
no, we did not.
In fact, your entire database, your entire African American database comes from the Red Cross, comes from the Red Cross in Detroit, Michigan, isn't that right?
Yes, it does.
And would you agree that to go from a database of 250 African Americans in Detroit to a number of 1 in 170 million to 1 in 1.2 billion, you had to make certain assumptions about the independence of these different genetic characteristics?
There are a whole series of assumptions built into that calculation, and one of them is independence, but there are also tests for independence in these databases which have been done, and they have been shown based on these tests that the markers are independent.
Now, Dr. Cotton, would you agree, however, that they are based on a number of assumptions? One of which you said is that these different genetic markers are inherited independently of one another.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that there is data to back up that assumption, and therefore it is not really an assumption at this point.
Would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that there is, would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that there has been substantial controversy in the scientific community about that very assumption that you've just described?
Should rephrase the question. It's vague.
You would, one moment. Referring specifically to the assumption of independence, would you agree that with respect to that assumption, and whether or not there is adequate data to demonstrate that it's an appropriate assumption, that that itself has been the subject of significant controversy in the scientific community?
Objection assumes facts, not evidence.
Sustain.
I'm asking her if it is.
I understand. Sustain. Would you rephrase the question, Counsel?
Well, Dr. Cotton, has there been controversy in the past about that very point?
Yes,
In fact, Dr. Cotton, that book that you had in your purse, or your briefcase, could you take it out again, please? The NRC report?
The NRC report?
Yes. The NRC report says that there's controversy around that very assumption, doesn't it?
Objection hearsay, Your Honor.
Sustain. Curious to disregard the implication of the question.
Dr. Cotton, isn't there an entire chapter, namely chapter...
Objection,
Sustain.
Your Honor.
Sustain. It's hearsay.
Dr. Cotton, you said that...
What's the nature of the controversy, Doctor?
There have been a few people who are experts in population genetics who have not agreed with the way statistical calculations are made for forensic casework as given in the RFLP example. There are also a large number of people who agree that the statistical calculations are appropriate. So depending on who you phoned up, you might find an opinion one way or the other.
So are you saying that you disagree with what the NRC says?
Excuse me, objection hearsay, Your
Sustain.
Honor.
Sustain.
Well, you said there were a few people, Dr. Cotton, who take that position. Isn't it a fact, Dr. Cotton, that as recently as November of 1994, more than 24...
Excuse me, objection, Your Honor.
Sustain.
May we approach...
I'm asking if she's aware.
No, you're calling, that, the question and answer calls for a hearsay conclusion as to the content of something, counsel. That's the problem. Sustain.
You said, Dr. Cotton, a moment ago, that there's a few scientists who are critical of that assumption. How many did you mean by a few?
The objection, I think, is hearsay also, Your Honor.
Based on the number of published articles that state an opinion one way or another, I would say there might be, this is sort of a little hard to answer, but maybe something around 5 or 6 people who have been vocal in their opposition to these calculations.
All right, Dr. Cotton, let me ask you this.
Could the witness finish your answer,
No,
please?
the question,
Yes.
I think that was responsive, and beyond
Well,
that, I
she
think
was still
beyond
speaking when you jumped in there, counsel.
Sorry, Your Honor.
And there's an objection. When the objection's made, you need to allow me to rule on it. Did you finish your answer, doctor?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, next question.
Do you know who Dr. Ronald Acton is?
Yes, I know Dr. Acton.
Has Dr. Acton written on the subject of population frequencies?
I'm aware of one paper that he's written.
Do you know who Dr. David Balding is?
Vaguely.
Do you know who Professor Joel Cohn is?
The objection relevance at this point, Your Honor.
Overruled.
I've read one paper by Dr. Cohen.
You've heard of him.
Well, through seeing his name on as the author of a paper.
Do you know who Professor and Dr. Jerry Coyne is?
I've heard of him. I haven't haven't read anything that I'm not aware that he's written anything on this topic.
Is he a population geneticist?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
Fine. Are you aware of any testimony that he's given in any cases without saying what it is?
Objection, Your Honor, irrelevant. Hearsay.
Sustain.
Do you know who Dr. Peter Donnelly is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. Seymour Geiser is?
Yes.
Is he a professor at the University of Minnesota?
Yes.
And Dr. Joel Cohn is professor at Rockefeller University?
The objection is to relevance, Your Honor.
Overruled. Do you know that?
I don't know.
All right, proceed.
Do you know who Dr. Paul Hagerman is?
Yes.
He's a professor at the University of Colorado?
Yes.
You know who Dr. Daniel Crane is?
Yes. I've read one of his papers. When I say yes, I don't know these people personally, but I may have either heard of them through court issues or read something that they wrote.
Do you know who Dr. Martin Kreitman is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. Charles Langley is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. Professor Richard Lewontin is?
Yes.
He's a professor at Harvard University.
I understand that's where he is.
He's a population geneticist.
Yes.
Do you know who Gary Littman is?
No.
Do you know who Michael Lynch is?
No.
By the way, I didn't say doctor before each name, but just so the record is clear, each one of these is a doctor.
Well, excuse me, Your Honor. Counsel's testifying now.
He is. Proceed. Curious to disregard that as
Do you know who Dr. Terry Markow is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. Lawrence Mueller is?
Yes.
Is he a professor at the University of California at Irvine?
As far as I know, yes.
in what? In what?
In the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology.
Well, excuse me, Your Honor. Is counsel testifying? as
No, I
well?
thought, as a question.
Question.
Do you know if he's a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology?
I think so, yes.
Do you know who Dr. Richard Nichols is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. Stephen Piper is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. Roland Richmond is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. William Shields is?
Your Honor, I'm going to object again as to relevance.
Overruled.
Yes.
Is Dr. William Shields a professor of population genetics and genetics at the State University of New York at Syracuse?
Yes, he is.
And do you know who Dr. Terry Speed is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. Charles Taylor is?
Yes.
Is Dr. Charles Taylor a professor of the Department of Biology at the University of California in Los Angeles?
He was last time I was aware of him.
And have you heard of Dr. Elizabeth Thompson?
Yes.
And she the chairman of the Department of Statistics at the University of Washington in Seattle?
I know she's at Seattle. I have no idea what her position is there.
And do you know who Dr. Michael Torelli is?
No.
Do you know who Dr. Donald... One moment. Excuse me. Do you know who Dr. Donald Ilvisacker is?
No.
And do you know who Dr. Sandy Zabel is?
No.
And finally, do you know who Dr. Marcus Feldman is?
The name sounds familiar, but again,
Would it refresh your recollection if you knew that he was a professor in the Department of Biology at Stanford University in California?
Assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustain.
I'm sorry, it doesn't help.
Now, hypothetically, Dr. Cotton, if all the people on that list,
Nope.
Excuse me, Your Honor.
Nope.
Objection.
Nope. 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 Nope.
Dr. Cotton, at any time in the last 5 months, have you seen a letter? I'm not saying the content of it, Your Honor.
Objection irrelevant. 721.
Sustain.
Dr. Cotton, at least as to the people whose names you recognized, do you agree that they have articulated that there exists a controversy?
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
As to-
Sustain.
Could we approach sidebar?
No. Sustain.
I would ask that this be marked next in order, to show it to the witness,
What?
a letter.
All right. Next in order. Oh, just hand
This
it.
is done.
Yes.
Okay,
I'm sorry, could I see the exhibit?
sure.
Is this a letter in Science magazine?
No?
What is this?
No.
May we approach you, please, Your Honor?
No.
All right.
What is it? Just tell me what it is.
It is, I'll tell you.
Mr. Neufeld?
May I have my exhibit?
I'd like to look at it first.
Okay.
Apparently a
Your
letter.
Honor, there's, do you want to speak in?
Counsel. What is it?
It is a letter written to Nature signed by
Thank you.
25 scientists.
Thank you.
Your Honor, that was rejected and never published.
Your Honor, it was rejected because
Oh,
I don't publish.
wait.
That was,
Both of you. Dr. Cotton, you can step down. All right, the court's clear orders regarding objections were no speaking objections. Both counselors sanctioned $250. Get your checkbooks out. Right now. The answer to the court's question was the letter proposed in Science magazine. The other part was objection. The fact that it was never published was an argument. I'm not going to tolerate that kind of stuff anymore. We clear? March over to the clerk, both of you. And the attorneys may not bill their clients for this. This is a personal sanction. You're welcome. And while they're writing counsel, I'm aware that this letter was circulated widely, but not published.
May I be, now that the jury's not here, may I be heard on this, Your Honor?
What you can do is ask if she's familiar with it and in any way relied upon it. If the answer is no, that's the end of it. That's 721 of the Evidence Code.
The only point I'd like to make, Your Honor, is that what I was about to say was I wanted to have a sidebar so I could explain exactly why it was rejected. Because what Mr. Clarke did,
I'm not getting into the publication policies of Science magazine, counsel. You're entitled to see if she relied upon it for the purposes of cross-examination. I assume you have your own experts who are going to come in. I'm sure we'll see Dr. Lewontin. All right, let's have the jury.
Your Honor, I would ask, though, for a curative with respect to what he had to say, because I didn't get to say anything as to the reason why, but he did say something that was completely improper that the jury did hear. The jury didn't hear...
As soon as they come in, I'm going to tell them to disregard everything that just went on, including my reaction.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome. Let's have the jurors. It's Friday. But I would like, if possible, to get Dr. Cotton home.
What, today?
No. Tomorrow is Friday.
As I explained to you, I thought we were
Well,
two
let's...
full business days.
Well, you got the court's expression of its opinion as to where we're going here and what's important.